Hey everyone, I'm glad to get back to talking about books today after the sort of angsty video that I posted last week. But I really appreciated all the kind and supportive comments that you posted. It was really heartening to see that. So thank you very much for responding. I only got one really nasty negative comment, but it was so over the top nasty that it was just really funny. But anyway, I've been so excited to get to this tag today. I've had a really busy, stressful week at work, but I've just been so enthusiastic and excited to get to this tag, which is Jennifer's classic and contemporary book tag, her original tag, which she very kindly tagged me in. And so this is quite an open-ended tag, just sort of pairing classic and contemporary works. And so I thought I would do my own sort of fun slant on it because, like Jennifer, I quite often mostly read contemporary literary fiction, but I get so interested in when I'm inspired to go back to classic literature, especially when contemporary books sort of reference classic fiction and classic authors. And also, I'm really interested in the lives of authors themselves. As you can tell from my many awkward encounters with authors. But why I think I'm so interested in authors themselves and why so many people are interested in authors and reading biographies, literary biographies of authors, is that because a book of fiction isn't just a artwork in itself, if you want to call it that, that's been ripped from the heavens. It comes from a particular person, and you can quite often see so much of that author's personality in the writing, and you naturally start to wonder who is this person that's writing this book. And a curious subgenre of literary fiction actually takes this a step further, where a contemporary author fictionally inhabits the life of a classic author and makes a novel out of it. So I'm going to talk about novels that turn classic authors into fictional characters. So I won't so much as hold up two books and say these are two pairings, but I'll hold up a contemporary novel and say this was inspired by the life of a classic author. I think this is really interesting because a lot of these novels and works of fiction are sort of these contemporary authors paying tribute to these authors that came before them and really engaging with the ideas and values that they were grappling with in their actual life and how that sort of played against the works of fiction or the books that they created. But also, in a way, it's sort of surpassing them, saying sort of I'm the new author now, and moving on from this literary past. And in some cases, it's the contemporary authors sort of arguing with or taking to task these authors from the past. So I think that's all really interesting. So I have a huge list of books to talk about, so I'm just going to start running through them and start with my favorites and then see how it goes. I'm going to start with Margaret the First by Danielle Dutton. This is a novel, a fairly recent novel that Jennifer also talked about in her video because she loves this novel too. And it's a fictional account of the life of Margaret Cavendish, who was a 17th century aristocrat and philosopher and writer who wrote this book called The Blazing World, which I also read recently. And why she's so particularly interesting and why she sort of inspired me to take this slant on the tag was because having read this book, The Blazing World, I can see why Danielle Dutton was so fascinated by who Margaret Cavendish was herself, because the writing in it is so bizarre that you just wonder who is this personality behind all of this writing. And so she takes that and she creates really grappling with the problems she would have faced in her life at this time, the ordeal of childbirth, if you can't give childbirth, and these horrible things that she was subjected to try to make her become pregnant. And but then also with her reckoning with her life as like a creative individual struggling to make her voice heard in this period, and also someone who is obviously had a lot of arrogance and like pride, and like she was so excited by like fashion and her image, and she just wanted to be famous. And so she was just a really fascinating personality. And so the way that Danielle Dutton creates this novel around her life is so interesting. And like, yeah, this is a book that really drew me back to the original author's work and made me want to experience Cavendish's writing for itself. Next is Wild Nights by Joyce Carol Oates. And you know I love Joyce Carol Oates, but let me tell you why this book is so amazing. Let me try to sell it to you. So picture a story about Emily Dickinson set in the future, where Emily Dickinson has been turned into a mechanized robot, which has become a companion for a housewife in this household in the future. And just the weird encounters this couple have with this little mechanized version of Emily Dickinson. It's sort of like a sci-fi story. It is so wild and crazy. And so this book is a book of short stories, but each short story is this sort of fictional reimagining of, like a really bombastic reimagining of the end of the lives of 5 different famous authors. So there's Emily Dickinson, and there's Ernest Hemingway, there's Henry James and Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe. And she creates these really strange, bombastic versions of the end of their lives. And like with Edgar Allan Poe, he moves to this remote lighthouse where he's sort of thinking about life and grappling with life, and gets this wild idea that he wants to push the evolution of life by creating a new kind of species. These stories are like fantastically wild, as the title says, and so fun and engaging, and really interesting way to look at these different authors' lives. And next is another book of short stories, Women I've Known by Greg Johnson. And Greg Johnson is an author who is especially interested in the lives of women. And I picked up on this after Wild Nights, because Greg Johnson has actually written a biography of Joyce Carol Oates. And so Women I've Known, this is a whole book of short stories, and a section of it deals particularly with the lives of different female authors from the past. And so he writes about the lives of Willa Cather and Flannery O'Connor, Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, and again, Emily Dickinson. And he creates these stories which are some of them are slightly fantastical in the way that they approach these authors' lives. Like with Willa Cather, he writes about this man from the future writing a paper about Willa Cather and her writing's relationship to homosexuality, how you can sort of see a gay subtext in some of the writing. And it's these letters going back and forth between this man from the future and Willa Cather in her present. And so it's this really interesting dialogue with the past. And then the story of Virginia Woolf does something similar, where somebody from the future encounters Virginia Woolf at a time in her life when she was just finishing writing her novel, The Years, which was a very difficult novel for her to write, and which wasn't a very successful novel and isn't one of her most remembered novels now. So it's sort of reckoning with this fact of this knowledge from the present that this novel won't go on to be one of her best, but then in the moment it's something that she struggled over so much, and so it's sort of this engagement with that crisis in an author's life. So yeah, this is such a great, really interesting book of short stories, and particularly with this section that really engages with these female authors. Sophie and the Sibyl by Patricia Duncker. And Patricia Duncker is a writer who I think doesn't really get the recognition that she's due. She's a really interesting writer, and this novel, Sophie and the Sibyl, it's sort of like a romantic comedy of manners, written in this Victorian style, but it makes it about the life of George Eliot, and it places George Eliot in this sort of romantic threesome and the drama that she has encountering these 2 other people. But it's written in a really interesting way, where at some points Patricia Duncker actually intrudes upon the text, and her voice is there on the page, which is, you know, something that was done a lot in more classic novels, but isn't done so much now. And so I think stylistically it's such a fascinating novel, and it's such a gripping, good read. And if you're interested in George Eliot, like this is a really interesting sort of slant on her life. In America by Susan Sontag. I love this novel so much. It's like one of my favorite novels of all time. I just think it's absolutely amazing. And if you're a bit intimidated by Susan Sontag, because, you know, she was this famous essayist, a really high intellectual, and but she later in her life she wrote these historical novels, which are so fascinating and intelligent, but also like rip-roaring good reads. And she sort of consciously wanted to write this commercial fiction because towards the end of her life she was facing a lot of poverty and she needed to earn some money. And so she wrote these novels, but they weren't just commercial enterprises. I think they're really great artworks in themselves, and particularly in America, which deals with the life of this sort of who's now a now obscure famous actress, but in her time in the 19th century, this actress called Helena Modjeska, who's a Polish actress that came to America, and she was sort of like the Meryl Streep of her day. She was this very talented, good actress, but she was also a progressive social thinker, and so she moved to America, and she wrote about in her memoirs. I have her memoirs here. It's this big, huge book, really beautiful old book, which are her diaries, and she wrote about how moving to California, she founded this utopian community. She had a lot of social values, and so Susan Sontag writes about her formation of this community in California, and like a lot of utopian communities, it sort of fell apart and like didn't really work as well as she hoped it would. But also this novel really grapples with this idea of like personality, and particularly with like an actress's personality, like thinking about who is the real person and who is the performance. And so it's this very like layered look at identity that I think is just so fascinating and engaging and well done. The Master by Colm Toibin. This is Toibin's fictional imagining of the life of Henry James. And James is obviously like incredibly well-known classic author who wrote these great, very highly stylized works of fiction, but he was very reserved in his personal life. So like in a way, this novel is an act of sacrilege, because like Henry James, before he died, like a lot of personal letters he had, he burned and completely destroyed because he didn't want this information to be known about him. And but it's fairly well certain, and most people agree that like James was probably a homosexual. And so Colm Toibin writes about an aspect of his sexual life which James would have been aghast to have seen like written about. And obviously it's a work of fiction, so it's just him imagining it, but he really gets inside the psychology of this repressed individual who nonetheless like created these great works of art. And then another novel, which I don't have a copy of. I don't know what happened to my copy of it, but it's Arctic Summer by Damon Galgut. This is a novel that was published several years ago, and similarly sort of brings to life in this fictional version the life of a classic author who you could call like a closeted queen, because E.M. Forster also famously like never publicly came out, even though he lived much longer than James. Like I think he died in the 70s actually, but he never publicly came out, but was like well known to be a gay man. And he wrote this classic gay novel called Maurice, which he never published in his lifetime because he sort of didn't dare to. And so Damon Galgut similarly writes about E.M. Forster's life as a gay man and his gay encounters, while also creating these works of fiction. And he does it in just such a sympathetic and beautiful way. And the title of the novel, Arctic Summer, is a novel that E.M. Forster started but didn't finish. And so this is him sort of giving his own version of that, while also telling a version of E.M. Forster's life. According to Queenie by Beryl Bainbridge, and really annoyingly, I bought this copy that was signed by the author, but I hate when they put these like stickers on books. I'm trying to sell them saying signed by the authors. I like tried to get the sticker off and I couldn't really get it off, and so that was really annoying. But Beryl Bainbridge is an author that I love and who sadly died several years ago. And she's a really fascinating author, and this is one of her later novels that is her fictional version of the life of Samuel Johnson. And she, although it's told from the perspective of a secondary character, sort of looking at Samuel Johnson and his relationship with this woman. And Samuel Johnson famously wrote the version of the dictionary and also an edition of Shakespeare, and he was so ambitious and so focused on writing these books that he suffered from a nervous breakdown, and so this novel records his period of sort of recovery and then the strange entanglements he has with this group of people. So it's a fascinating take on this author's life from the 1700s. Samarkand by Amin Maalouf. This is his fictional version of the life of the 11th century Persian poet Omar Khayyam and the creation of his famous work Rubaiyat. And so it gives an account of his life with this female poet and his writing of his big, like, poetic work. And then it's interesting, the second half of the book is about an American who tries to track down a first edition of Rubaiyat and tries to find it, and the dramatic thing that happens after he finds this version. The Words in My Hand by Guinevere Glasfurd. This is a novel about the life of the 17th century mathematician and famous philosopher René Descartes. And it's about his time living in Amsterdam and a love affair he has with a servant girl who she has sort of intellectual ambitions of her own. And so it's about their relationship, but also like a life that's dedicated to intellectual pursuits. Next are a couple of novels by the same author, who's one of my favorite authors, which is Edmund White. And these two books, there's Fanny a Fiction and Hotel de Dream, and they're sort of unusual in Edmund White's body of work in that they're historical novels dealing with figures from the far past who aren't really, it isn't the sort of writing that he normally does, and so it was sort of like an experimentation on his part to write about these historical figures. And it's really interesting, the particular ones that he chose, because they aren't ones that you would expect, because Edmund White wrote this big long biography of Jean Genet, and so you would sort of expect him to write a novel about Jean Genet, but no, he wrote this novel called Fanny a Fiction, which is a depiction of two writers. One of them, Francis Wright, was a famous progressive of the early 1800s who wrote a lot about feminism and social progression and had really strong political ideas. And so she was another person that traveled to America to found a utopian community, which really, like, horrifically famously failed. And she went to found this utopian community after writing this book called Views of Society and Manners in America, where she had these high ideals about America, which didn't quite play out when she actually moved there to found this community. So it's about her story, but also about another woman, also called Frances or Fanny, Frances Trollope, who was the mother of Anthony Trollope, the famous writer. But Frances Trollope was a friend of Francis Wright, and so she went to America to visit Francis Wright at this community and witnessed what was happening. And at that stage in Frances Trollope's life, she was on the brink of poverty herself and struggling to support her family and her many children. Like, I think Anthony was like her sixth child. And so Frances Trollope went on a journey across America after visiting Francis Wright, and she ended up writing this travelogue called Domestic Manners of the Americans, which went on to be this big bestseller and made her into a very famous writer. And Frances Trollope went on to write a number of books. These sort of, I think they're kind of romances. I've never read any of them, but apparently they're quite bad. But she was fairly successful at it. And so it's this interesting depiction of two women in the 19th century, of two very different kinds of womanhood, because Frances Trollope was a very different kind of person from Frances Wright. And so this is a really fascinating take on those two historical characters. And then Edmund White's novel Hotel de Dream is his fictional version of the life of Stephen Crane, who was a famous writer who wrote The Red Badge of Courage and Maggie, A Girl in the Streets, I think it's called. And so this is really interesting. He takes a piece of gossip from Stephen Crane's life, because apparently Stephen Crane was a heterosexual man, but he was really a socially engaged author. Like, he wrote this girl, Maggie, A Girl in the Streets, about the life of this destitute woman and who's a prostitute. And apparently it's rumored that Stephen Crane also met a male prostitute in New York and became friends with him and was interested in writing a novel about his life as well, and had started writing a novel about it, but a friend advised him to destroy this novel because, like, even for a controversial writer like Stephen Crane, a novel about a gay prostitute would have, like, destroyed his reputation. And so Edmund White takes that story and writes about Stephen Crane's life. And Stephen Crane died quite young, and he was very sickly, but he writes about his encounter with this male prostitute, or this like painted boy, and creates this really fascinating novel out of it. And next is a novel which is sort of related to Edmund White, which is Everyone is Watching by Meghan Bradbury. And I say that because Edmund White is actually a fictional character in this novel. So it's sort of like continuing the tradition on. But it's actually about four figures. It's also about Walt Whitman, and also about the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe and the city planner Robert Moses. And so it's a depiction of these four different men's lives, but also a depiction of New York City, and particularly quite a big depiction of gay New York City. And so it's about these men's sort of like erotic relationship with the city as well. And so I think it's really interesting, a way of looking at city over time through sort of the eyes of four different famous historical figures that sort of chronicled it and gave their own versions of it. Next is another depiction of a city over a long period of time, in this case Tokyo, and that's Tito Monogatari by Hiroshiro Mota. And this is a really epic sort of fantasy science fiction book, a 12-volume novel that was written in the 70s, which is a depiction, one part of it is a depiction of the life of Yuko Mishima, who was this really fascinating author who wrote a lot of very like stylized, beautiful books, but had a very conflicted life himself. He was gay, and he eventually committed suicide, ritual suicide. But the section on Mishima's life is only one small part of this book. So it also depicts the lives of the Japanese writers Kota Rohan and Izumi Kiyoka. But the bulk of this novel is a massive, like, romanticized retelling of 20th century life in Tokyo. And then I have another depiction of a city, which is London Triptych by Jonathan Kemp. This is a fantastic novel. I love it so much. It's a novel in 3 parts that shows different points in a century of London life. And the first part starts in 1894, and it depicts the life of a gay prostitute in London who befriends Oscar Wilde. And so it sort of depicts Oscar Wilde and his sort of group of people that he was with, and the writing that he did, and then the troubles that he encountered when he was outed and put on trial. But then it also depicts the lives of a painter in mid-20th century London, and then the life of a gay prostitute in the late 90s. And it's just a beautifully told, really moving novel that shows London over a century. The Hours by Michael Cunningham. I had to talk about this book since also similarly like London Triptych, it's a novel in 3 parts that show 3 different points in a century, and the first part of the century famously depicts the life of Virginia Woolf and her time struggling before her eventual suicide. And this is another novel which is just so beautifully told, so moving, a really interesting way of looking at womanhood over a century and the connections between these different women's lives. It's a really touching look at the progression of time. The Passages of H.M. by J. Perini. This is a novel that depicts the life of Herman Melville. And funnily, I saw when I picked up my copy of this book, I had an old airplane ticket stuck in it. So it's really funny when you go through your old books and find things that you've stuck in them. But anyway, this novel is told through the perspective of Lizzie, who is Herman Melville's wife. And it depicts Herman Melville sort of towards the end of his life when he was very tortured, sort of broken down because he wasn't very successful. He'd put out Moby Dick, which he hoped would be this great acclaimed work, but which fantastically failed. But then, as we know with the passage of history, that it's become this classic American novel. And so it's a novel that brings into question sort of artistic enterprise like that. Should it matter if you have success during your life, or is it your legacy what really counts? And it's really interesting how Perini gives these depictions of sort of snapshots of Herman Melville's life. The Dictionary of Animal Languages by Heidi Pinker. This is a very recent novel, which is a fictionalized version of the life of Leona Carrington, who's the figure that's sort of come back into vogue. She was a surrealist artist and also a writer who wrote this book of short stories called The Hearing Trumpet. And Leona Carrington's life was very fascinating because she was born into a very privileged family, but then and she was educated by nuns, but then she rebelled against this life to go to Paris during the interwar period between the First and Second World Wars, and became friends with this group of surrealist artists, and then became an artist herself. And so it's about her sort of artistic ambitions and romantic entanglements, but then also this novel shows her at the end of her life when she's in her 90s trying to write this book called The Dictionary of Animal Languages. So I want to end really quickly talking about a couple of different kind of novels, because I know that this list that I've given is hyper Western. I found it really difficult to find non-Western and non-white examples of novels that are about writers. But one novel that's really interesting is a novel called Erasure by Percival Everett. And this is a novel about a writer who is very frustrated with the way that Black experience and Black writing is sort of pigeonholed in the literary community, and particularly how in the 90s sort of these Black writers were being published and sort of pigeonholed because they only showed a particular kind of Black experience. And it's about, so this novel is about a writer who's frustrated that different kinds of Black experience aren't being represented in these books that are being published. And within this novel, as sort of an example of this, the writer in this novel writes a satirical novel, which is sort of published in its entirety within the novel. And this novel within a novel is kind of a satirical take on Richard Wright's Native Son, and also Sapphire's novel Push. And so this novel as a whole plays on expectations of what Black writing is and what can be depicted in novels by Black writers. And then finally is a novel which is a really fascinating oddity in Vladimir Nabokov's body of work. He wrote a lot of novels, and this novel, The Gift, was the last novel that he wrote in Russian, when he was still writing in Russian before he started writing in English. And this book is a really interesting transitional novel for Nabokov, and it has a kind of strange structure, and it's sort of his reckoning with famous Russian writers. So there's sections of this book which are sort of a satirical play on Gogol and Pushkin, and then also one part of this book is sort of a pseudo-biography of a Russian writer called what's his name? Nikolai Chernyshevsky. I'd never heard of before, but apparently this writer was a favorite writer of Lenin's. And so the book can be seen and interpreted as sort of Nabokov grappling with this great Russian literary tradition that he comes from. So that is it. There's a lot of books covered. But do you have any favorite novels that are sort of fictional versions of the lives of authors? And have you read any of these books, or are you sort of like interested to read any of these, either these contemporary novels or these classic authors? Let me know in the comments below. And I know that like it seems like a strange thing to do that these writers wrote about writers, because you would think the life of a author wouldn't be all that interesting, because most of the time it's just an individual sitting in solitude writing. But I think it's really interesting how these contemporary books show that these these classic authors from the past were really grappling with the ideas and values of society at their time. And so it's like an interesting take on history and an interesting take on literary traditions. So thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye everyone.